Hello everybody and welcome to Painting with Rob Boss. Today we're going to be painting this character here. His name is Hammerhead Harold. We're going to be using oil paint today, so you need some oil paint, a variety of colors. It doesn't really matter too much. You need to have some black and white for the underpainting, and then just a regular palette of colors will do. It's not super important that all the colors match what I've got here. You're also going to need a pencil and some brushes. So go ahead and grab whatever you need, and let's get started.
We're gonna paint, don't tell me that you ain't. We're gonna draw, cause I'm laying down the law. We're gonna art, if you don't like it, smell a flower. Cause I'm not good here without power. Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Who's the boss? If you have a glass, it's painted with rubber. We're gonna paint, don't tell me that you ain't. We're gonna draw, cause I'm laying down the law. We're gonna art, if you don't like it, smell a flower. Cause I'm not good here without power. Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Who's the boss? If you have a glass, it's painted with rubber.
Alright, so our first step here is going to be to tone our canvas. So we just want to lay down a little bit of color on the canvas to get rid of the white of the canvas. So we're going to mix an earth tone. It doesn't really matter exactly what earth tone you use. You could just use some yellow ochre like I've got here. I'm going to add in a little bit of alizarin crimson. You can add in any red really, and make kind of an orange. But an earth tone for our purposes is going to be anything between yellow ochre and brown, all the way through a range of oranges. And we want to mix a nice earth tone here, and then we're going to want to apply a thin wash of the earth tone all over the whole canvas. We're going to add turpentine, or in our case we're using water mixable oil, so we're going to add some water to this to make our wash. And we just want it to be thin, so this is a little too thick, so I'm going to add a little more solvent. And we just want a thin wash over the entire canvas there. And then we're going to let that dry for a little bit. We want to keep it thin because that'll make it dry much faster. We also want to introduce a fair amount of solvent because that will that'll increase the drying speed. So just a light wash over the whole canvas. For this next step, we're going to be using a pencil to draw in our character here. So I suggest using a softer pencil. I like to use a 4B. You could use something even softer than that. You can do this same technique using charcoal. There's a lot of different options for you, but we're just going to use a 4B pencil today. and I want to sketch my character in. I want to draw kind of darkly today. I can kind of initially sketch it light, but I want to go kind of darker for my final drawing because I'm actually going to be kind of blending the graphite here into my paint as I paint in the next step for the underpainting. So I'm just kind of starting off here by sketching in Harold's eyes and his hammer head. So we've got kind of a T shape at an angle here. And then I'm coming down, and he has kind of a neck that thickens up near the base and gets a little skinnier up top. So kind of a simple shape like this. Now I'm going to darken this in a little bit. I'm going to add the mouth here. So he's got kind of an open mouth, so it's hanging open a little bit. It sticks out a little bit from the rest of his body, then kind of curves over like this at this angle. I'm going to add a little bit of a curve to the edge of his lip to make it look like he has like a rounded lip there. And then I'll add the upper part of the mouth. And then I'm going to kind of add an eye onto right here. And we've got his head. I'm going to go on to add the rest of the body here. I'm going to give him a collar. So I kind of have almost a rectangular shape that follows the curve of his neck. A little bit wider at the front than at the back. Kind of a almost diamond shape to make the knot of the tie. And then the tie is going to proceed down from there. I'll add the other collar on the other side. I'm going to make it a little bit tighter than his neckline there to make it look like he's really kind of squeezed into that shirt. Now I'm adding the shoulders, and I'm going to give him some suspenders as well. So your Harold doesn't have to look exactly the same as mine. No biggie if he doesn't. This is really about kind of techniques for using the oil paints. So it's okay if yours looks a little different. But just try to use some of the techniques that I'm showing here. Here's his other shoulder. I'm going to make this one a little bit wider here. I don't actually need to erase anything. I can just kind of draw over and go a little bit darker. I'll pull that out anyway. You want to be careful about erasing on the panel. Mine's still slightly wet, so especially in that situation, it can kind of make more of a mess than it fixes. So be careful about it. Now I'm just going to kind of darken in the drawing. You're also going to see as I darken the drawing in that I'm shading it. And again, when I'm adding the shadow, when I'm adding the lines, I want to get a fair amount of graphite onto that canvas, so I want to shade darkly. So for once, we're not going to be sketching light. We're going to be drawing and shading darkly. So it doesn't really matter how you shade. You can kind of use hatching or cross-hatching. You can use like squiggles. It doesn't matter at all. This is all going to be kind of covered up by the paint. It's going to blend into the paint. I'm adding the teeth in on the bottom lip here. You don't really need to worry about that right now because we're going to actually be painting over those to paint in the mouth. And we'll add them back in later. So it's not a huge concern right now. So for my shading, I'm thinking about a light source coming from above and over to the right. So anything that's either the underside of something or facing to the left is going to have some shadow on it. And the more I can get those shadows drawn in a way that kind of makes logical sense, the better it's going to look. But even if I just kind of follow that simple rule and kind of think about shading anything that's facing down or to the left, I'll get a pretty decent sort of shadow scheme in there, and it should be quite passable. So we'll have a little under his lip here because it's downturned. And they don't have to be perfect right now. We can kind of adjust them in the painting phase. But the better we get them now, the better it's going to be. So, you know, find the balance there, I guess, is what I'm suggesting. I'm going to add the fin back here coming out of his back. I think that's a nice touch. And I'm going to add kind of a top ridge up here where the light's hitting it. And then I'm going to add shadow to the side over here. And then I'm going to add some touches of shadow in his shirt and tie and the suspenders as well. So again, for these, I'm thinking which direction each of these surfaces is facing. If there are any surfaces that are facing to the left or downward, I'm going to shade them. And I'm also going to kind of thicken up any lines that are on the left side of something, because that's going to give a little hint of shadow underneath those suspenders or underneath the tie there as well. I'm going to actually shade kind of his whole arm over here because it's facing to our left. All right, so that pretty much wraps up the sketch here. You can pause it here and take some time to catch up if you need to, and then we'll move on to the next step in just a second. Okay, for our next step, we're going to be using mostly white paint and a little bit of black paint to create a black and white underpainting. So the idea here is to capture all of the values and shading in the image. And that's our primary concern. And then we're going to worry about color in the next step. So I'm actually just taking a little bit of solvent. I'm using water because I've got water, soluble oils. You could use a little turpentine for this or a little medium, maybe some liquid or something like that. Any of those options should be fine. And we're just going to kind of liquefy the graphite here. And we're going to try to use the graphite that's already on there to create most of the shadows. If we have any really deep shadows or when we paint that mouth in, we're going to have to use some black. But for the most part, we're just going to use that graphite to create the shadows. And after we kind of get these blocked in and kind of unified, we're going to go back in with our white paint and add the highlight areas and the halftones. Alright, so there's most of our big shadows. And then we'll have to get a couple of the little thin shadow lines or strips on the clothing there. I'll go ahead and speed this up a little bit, just because I think that's all I have to say about it right now. So now we're going to add in some white. So what we're painting in right now are the highlights and halftones. For the halftones, it's okay if you let some of the charcoal, or graphite in this case, mix in with them. That's alright. It's also okay if you use some of the orange or earth tone from the back of the canvas to kind of make the halftones. Not everything has to be like totally black and white and gray. So I'm adding my white paint to the brightest highlights primarily, and then kind of moving it towards the shadows. And then where I have gradations between the shadow and light areas, I can pull a little bit of the graphite into the paint and make those transitions a little more gradual. So after I get through this, I can build up the highlights a little bit more if I need to. But we're just kind of trying to get our highlights and our halftones mapped out now that we've got our shadows laid in. So I'm going to go ahead and speed this up for a little bit, and then we'll talk to you about the next step. So you can see here how the graphite mixes in to create a range of grays, and it almost creates those gradations naturally by just kind of dragging the graphite into the painted surface. You may end up having to go in and touch up your highlights a little bit by adding some fresh white to them as you work. It usually helps to kind of stipple with the brush a little bit. That helps to keep the whites from mixing in too much with everything else that's going on. I mixed a little black. I'm going to use that just to paint in the mouth. If you have any shadows that you'd like to deepen a little bit, you can add a little bit of black to them, or you can mix it kind of darker gray and add that. But a lot of times it really won't be necessary. If you've got something like what I've got here, you're probably all set for the next step. At this point, we're actually going to let this sit and wait until our next session, so you can call this closed. If you have extra time, you can go ahead and paint in the background. That's no problem. With this, you can do whatever you want with the background. I don't really care. So pick a color you like and paint it in. Alright, so if we have enough time this session to add a background, we can go ahead and do that. You can mix, like I said, whatever background color you want. I'm just going to do kind of a little bit of red. Kind of various shades of red. I want kind of a mottled background instead of like a flat tone. Just kind of a variety of shades back there. So I'm going to mix that in. I'm going to thin it out a little bit, but I don't want it too washy. And then I'm just going to paint in the background with it. You can add different colors in and kind of blend them. Just play around really and try to figure out what you think looks good. While adding the background, it might be a good idea to think about kind of what colors you want to include in Harold's clothing here. And I'm going to let you kind of choose what colors to paint his clothes as well. So anyway, I'll speed this up so you can watch it. There's not a whole lot more to explain about it though. So just let's go fast. All right, for our next step, we're going to be glazing our underpainting. So it's important that we gave the painting some time to dry, so we want to do this in another session. Ideally, the painting would be dry. If it's a little bit tacky, that's probably okay, but we don't want it to be totally wet still. So you can mix whatever tones you want for this. I'm going to be painting his clothes different colors, so I'm mixing kind of a purple for his shirt. I'm going to give him kind of a lavender shirt. I'm going to keep the collar white, I think, to give that white collar, colored shirt kind of look that fancy office boys like these days. And I'm going to paint his suspenders red and his tie kind of orange. But you can choose your own colors for this. So we want to glaze. So after we mix the color we want, we need to thin it so that it's thin enough that we can see the underpainting through it. So if you think more like a watercolor, sort of similar to a wash, we don't want it to be that runny. So we want a little more medium to keep it thicker. But you can add a little bit of solvent there, a little bit of turpentine, or water if you're using water-soluble oils or acrylics. And we want to kind of paint that on. So we can kind of judge as we start to add this whether it's too thick or too thin. So you'll start to see, once this gets kind of spread out, that we can still see the underpainting through it. And that's what we're looking for here. We still want to be able to see those light versus shadow areas. If it gets a little bit too much color for the highlights, that's okay, because we can introduce some more white or a lighter shade of whatever color we're using and bring those highlights back up. But we do want to be able to see the difference between the light areas and the shadow areas. So we'll kind of follow that same procedure to paint all the clothing as well as the skin tone for Harold. So you'll be able to see what I'm doing as I run through and kind of follow along. Again, you can choose your own colors for this. There's no reason you have to use the same ones as me. If you want to, that's totally fine. But he can have any color combination of clothes that you like. So I think that's all I have to explain. So I'll go ahead and speed this phase up. All right, so at this point, we've got everything pretty well painted in. I kept Harold with sort of a gray skin tone, but you can make it bluer or more purple. You can make it any color you want, really, but those would be some kind of realistic shark colors, like a blue to gray range. I think any colors in there would be viable. Right now, though, I'm strengthening some of my shadows here. So I've mixed a shadow tone by combining some darker colors together. I want it to be kind of purpley, but I want it to be like a low saturation purple. So I mix some other tones in there. Since purple is complementary to red, I mixed a little bit of yellow ochre in there to desaturate it a little bit. And I don't necessarily want to go super dark either. So this gives you a nice value that's desaturated and pretty flat. We don't want our shadows most of the time to be super intense saturation. We really want to save our high saturation colors and use them sparingly for the most part. So this is kind of a good way to do it. After we get these shadows kind of strengthened, we can go back in and add the details we need to add. You'll see that I've also added those teeth over the black mouth. It's important that the black mouth is fairly dry before we add those teeth, so that the paint doesn't just mix in with the underpainting there. And I'll polish up some of the details. I'll add a little bit more to the background, and then we'll be done. And I think that's all I can really verbalize on this. So I'll speed up the rest of it, and you can see what our final product looks like. As you can see, I decided to work back into the background a little bit. You might want to add to that and finish it up. Try to make it work with the paintings or the colors you've chosen for the clothing there. Kind of chosen a mottled background with some variety of colors back there. And I think it works pretty nicely with Harold there. Hopefully you learned a little bit about how to work with a black and white underpainting and glaze color in. I hope that it was helpful and instructional to you. We will see you next time. Rob Boss, signing off. Goodbye.
We're gonna paint. Don't tell me that you ain't.